If you were to ask any person to name a specific visual effect, I would bet that green screen would be the most common answer. This effect has entered the cultural zeitgeist like no other visual effect has, purely because of its use in big budget Hollywood films like Marvel, Disney, and like countless others, but it's also pretty easy to conceptually understand. A person stands in front of a green screen, you take that green out and substitute it with another background. We've seen it on like weather reports, TV shows, and movies for like forever, so it's just common, and nowadays you can even do it pretty easily from home. One second. Ow. Well, I think that's done. All good. Of course I need someone in post-production to like take out the green and put stuff behind it. Isn't that right, Kane? Yes, it is, Kane, but luckily enough for us, most editing softwares have like a built-in green screen effect that you can just drag and drop on a clip. For example, in Premiere Pro, there's a thing called Ultra Key, and if you just drag it onto the footage, pick the color in the background, it basically like disappears. After a few tweaks, you can drag in your other background and voila, it's done. But what is actually going on inside the computer for like all this to happen? Like, someone had to figure this out. People didn't have Ultra Key and Premiere Pro in the early days of film, but they still made this, and this. Well, I think the answers lie in the history of the green screen. To start our journey, we go all the way back to the late 1800s with this guy, George Méliès. He was an illusionist and one of the first people to experiment with film as an art form. Méliès first saw a film camera in action in 1895 from the Lumiere brothers and was determined to get his hands on one. By 1897, he was experimenting with film and what it could achieve. Over the next 20 years, it's estimated he created over 500 films, most of which showcasing different illusions. In this time, he popularized many effects, including multiple exposures, time lapses, and even dissolves. In VFX Artistry by Spencer Drake and Judith Salovets, they describe Méliès as the father of in-camera trickery and special effects, culminating in his beloved film A Trip to the Moon in 1902. At this time, green screen technology doesn't exist, but the elements that would become the basics of green screen were born: compositing and mattes. Compositing is basically putting multiple visual elements together within a scene, and a matte just allows you to do this. Let's take George Méliès' The Four Troublesome Heads from 1898 as an example. Méliès figured out if you could black out part of the frame on film and record something, the blacked out part wouldn't be exposed. You can then black out the opposite part of the frame, rewind the film, record something else, and you have a new composition. So in Méliès' example, he would have covered where the heads are and filmed the actual heads in the next pass, together creating the illusion. This example from Méliès is a little wonky, but a more refined example was from Edwin S. Porter's film The Great Train Robbery in 1903. Again, an in-camera matte is used to show a train flying past a building. Similar to Méliès' example, the first pass would have been filming the actors in a room with the window being blacked out, the second pass would have had everything but the window blacked out, and then they would have just gone and filmed a train. And together they create the final shot, which would have been revolutionary for the time period. Around the same time, another method of matting was developed called the glass shot. A piece of glass would be put in front of a camera, and an artist would paint a set extension that would seamlessly be added to the shot. The first example of this comes from Norman Dorn, who used this method to seemingly restore old buildings in the 1907 film Missions of California. This method would progress over the years with many films such as Citizen Kane and Star Wars using matte paintings to create set extensions. This time not being painted on glass, but rather using the traditional matting process similar to the Great Train Robbery example. But to jump back to the early 1900s, these static mattes were all well and good, but what happens when the camera or an actor moves? That would mess up the whole process. So the race to create the traveling matte was born. A method known as the blackback matting process was patented in 1918 by Frank Williams. This method was used in the classic 1933 movie The Invisible Man.
Look, He's all eaten away.
The actor would wear black velvet under his clothing and was shot against a pure black background. Then the shot of the background and actors were composited in later, and the Invisible Man was born. In the 1930s, a different technique was developed called rear projection. Instead of doing multiple exposures on film to add in a background, rear projection took a simple approach. As projectors were getting more and more reliable, they were used to project an image on a large screen that was placed behind the actors. The camera would then record the scene as normal, essentially making a composition in real time. This method was refined by Farshad in 1933 for the movie Flying Down to Rio. The effect is more famous for being used when characters are driving cars in movies. A loop of moving scenery would be projected while the actors are just sitting in the cars, giving the illusion that the car is actually moving. A comically bad example of this is found in the James Bond movie Dr. No. Finally, in the 1940s, we get something similar to the green screen, but this time it was blue. A man named Larry Butler created and used the blue screen method on The Thief of Baghdad in 1940, the first major use of the method in a high-budget film.
Listen, inside my bottle for the first 1,000 years, I swore that I'd enrich the one that freed me with all the riches of the earth. But in the second 1,000 years, my imprisoned spirit turned to vengeance on all that lived and were free.
Since film was now in colour, Butler figured out that you could put any colour behind the actor and then just remove it afterwards and then add in another background. It was so revolutionary, in fact, that Butler won an Oscar for Best Visual Effects later that year. Although it was a huge step forward for travelling mattes, it still wasn't perfect. Motion blur, hair, and smoke couldn't be picked up easily, and the process itself was very time consuming, as the effect would be applied to every frame individually. Around the same time, Petra Vlahos was working with Disney to create another method to achieve a travelling matte. The method used sodium vapor lights that had a very specific yellow colour that it emitted, allowing the matte to have sharper edges and be more clean than its blue screen counterpart. The process was also a lot simpler. A prism that split off the specific yellow light was put in front of the camera, allowing the footage and matte to be created all in camera, instead of the lengthy process it took for blue screen. This method was most famously used in the Disney classic Mary Poppins from 1964. But there was one problem with this method. The prism that was used to split the light was very hard to make and only one was ever usable, so this method was very effective but extremely exclusive. To remedy this, Vlahos also refined the original blue screen method. Throughout the 50s, he created a more reliable method that fixed the problems of the original, finally patenting his creation as the colour difference travelling matte system that was first used in 1959's Ben-Hur. This method was the basis of all blue screen effects that you see up to present day. Vlahos really did revolutionize the visual effects landscape with his work developing the travelling matte. He was also instrumental in creating motion control cameras that allowed for camera movements while using blue screen. His work paved the way for the creation of sweeping space operas like Star Wars to expansive epics like Titanic. The next big development came when editing went digital. During the 90s, non-linear editing gained popularity. Instead of physically cutting and stitching film back together where you wanted to make a cut, non-linear editing allowed the editor to cut without disrupting the original film. Basically, all the film was digitized in some way and then edited in a computer. This way of editing prevented generation loss too, so multiple versions of the film didn't have to be made. By the turn of the century, most film editors were using non-linear editing software to cut their films, such as Avid or Final Cut and later Premiere Pro. This was a massive relief for the use of the blue screen method too, as up until this point it was all done manually by hand and required a lot of resources. In order for the blue screen method to actually work, the footage had to be split up into red, green and blue channels and rearranged in a special way to achieve the effect. Of course, each channel had to have its own reel of film, but ultimately it took a lot of time and effort to achieve the effect. Luckily, with computers quickly taking over the post-production aspect of film, the blue screen process was easier than ever to create. Computers took the place of big bulky machines and the effect became even more streamlined. Around the same time, the green that we know and love became more popular as the colour to remove from shots. Blue was previously chosen by Butler because it was the furthest colour away from skin tones, but in the digital age, green seemed to be a better option because more detail can be found in the green channel. But nowadays both are pretty much used interchangeably. In the early 2000s, as editing became digital, production also was starting to become digital. Digital cameras were getting better and better in quality and were much more reliable than film, as you could shoot an enormous amount of takes and don't have to worry about buying more film. CGI, or computer-generated imagery, was also getting a lot more popular and realistic. It even got to the point where matte paintings and background plates were getting replaced with 3D computer-generated imagery, allowing the whole process to be in computer. An example of this can be found in one of the first movies to be shot fully digitally, David Fincher's Zodiac. Fincher had always been on the cutting edge of special effects, as he started out as a compositor on many classic 80s films. On the DVD extras of Zodiac, the compositors explain how a lot of the movie's backgrounds are completely CG, as to represent the city of San Francisco in the 60s as accurately as possible. A scene towards the middle of the movie, where a camera follows a car from a bird's eye view, is almost completely CG, except for a couple blue screen elements of people walking. It just goes to show how blue screen is still such an integral element to modern films. Movies like these open the door to blue screen and green screen laden era of action movies that are still popular today. Marvel, Star Wars and more all use mostly green screen to create fantastical worlds that Méliès could only dream of. Now that we've hit present day and learned about the history of the green screen, what's the future? Will the green screen stick around? I'm not too sure, but another sort of technology is getting very popular recently, and it could usher in the death of the green screen. LED panels. In the 2020s, Disney was once again in the forefront of creating new technology for film. Industrial Light and Magic opened a new division called ILM TV in 2018 to focus on TV and streaming content. Its first main project was The Mandalorian. The team wanted to emulate the expansive Star Wars world, but didn't want to shoot on location, so they turned to LED screens. LED screens were getting to such high resolutions that you could realistically use it as a background for film or TV, achieving a very similar effect to rear projection, where all the compositing is done in camera. But ILM partnered with Epic Games, pushed this idea further. They used Epic Games' knowledge of Unreal Engine to create stagecraft, an on-set visual effects technology to be used in conjunction with LED panels. This software allowed the user to drop in any model into a scene and move it around, all the while being on set, essentially doing complex CG compositing on set before even shooting anything. On top of this, the software tracks the camera's motion and changes to fit what the camera should see. So complex camera moves can be achieved on set with immediate feedback from the background, creating the proper parallax effect that is so necessary to achieve realism. A smaller LED screen was used in production on Solo: A Star Wars Story, but a full-size 6.4 meter tall set that was 23 meters in diameter was used on The Mandalorian, creating a full circle of LED screens that could emulate any place imaginable. It was used for both indoor and outdoor settings, and the real-time feedback from the light made it feel even more realistic. Of course, set design was used to transition from the real world to the completely CG one to make it seamless. For example, only half of a spacecraft had to be physically made, and the other half was created inside stagecraft. The LED screens were also a huge help in reflections on the Mandalorian's armor, as they would immediately show up perfectly on set, where if it was done with green screen, all of the reflections would have had to be done in post. Since the release of The Mandalorian, the LED panel technology has been set up in multiple places, from LA, London, to even right here in Australia. It's exciting to see this technology become the norm in the future, as more and more TV shows are beginning to implement it, most recently Marvel's Moon Knight series. Or is this just a passing fad, and the green screen will still remain on top? When I first started to research about the green screen, I had a very surface level understanding of what it was. I knew that if you put a color behind you, you could get rid of it and substitute it with something else, but through learning about the history of this effect, I found it was integral to the development of all visual effects. The basic components of green screen were first developed over 100 years ago, and those principles really haven't changed. It's just the way we get to those principles is what's changed. My research has also taught me about how much work was put into creating this effect that I just took for granted. People like George Méliès, Norman Dorn, Larry Butler, Petr Vlahos, and many, many more were all geniuses and deserve credit for all their hard work that they've done for visual effects and filmmaking. Hopefully this 15-minute presentation does them justice. Thanks for watching.